Welcome back to part 2 of Chapter 2 material for IT Audit and Control. And we left off talking about the different types of organizational structure. The book talks about centralized and decentralized. I want to bring up the third possibility, which most organizations are some form of federated organization, which means some of the services are centralized, some of them are decentralized. It's very popular. That's why the U.S. Picked a federated model, which means we're not completely centralized in Washington, D.C., nor are we completely decentralized with local government, but instead we have a federated model where individual states are represented, but there are also plenty of centralized agencies. And business organizations tend to follow a similar model, especially when it comes to IT, because some things just have to be centralized, like servers and such. They're designed to be a centralized, shared resource. The model on campus is kind of interesting. I would say we're also a federated model at SIUE because a lot of ITS is centralized, but a lot of it is very decentralized. So, for example, CMIS, or in the School of Business in general, has their own IT support person, and I'm told other departments across campus have their own dedicated IT support people. There are good and bad things about this, but federated is definitely the most popular. What you do want to avoid is having, and I've got this in green because this is just kind of a life lesson, you want to avoid having shadow IT departments, which means people that are doing the IT function that have no accountability to the IT department up through the CIO. So if you have people doing their own support and kind of installing their own IT hardware on the production network, that can be a bad thing because things get out of control very quickly if you allow that to happen. Just a picture. I found a nice picture of what a federated model looks like. Maybe I need to get my face out of the way somehow, but you can still see. Here, I can maybe do that or something. Move me down here. This is just an example, but totally centralized, everything is in one place. Totally decentralized, everything's spread out. Federated, some things are shared, like IT hardware and software standards. Processes can be a little more distributed. Maintenance can be even more distributed. I think this is just one version, but it's a popular version of a federated model. I would ignore that. This is a bold statement. All successful data governance models are federated. I'm not going to go that far. Mostly I just like this picture, but it is a good example of, here are the things that happen in a federated model go away. Okay. There are plenty of other control issues that IT cares about that the COSO model simply doesn't talk about. If people have illegal software installed, if there's a change management process, and by change management I mean something is a new thing is developed and it's tested in development in a proper test environment, and then rolled out in a safe, secure, and well communicated way into your production environment, is not, as far as I can tell, part of COSO at all. The tracking of hardware assets, lifecycle management for hardware, COSO just does not cover everything that we care about in IT, but it's a start, and it's a very popular framework, but it does come from a financial end. So the COSO framework is very familiar to accounting people, but for IT people we need something a little more. Now, no matter what governance framework you use, this has everything to do with the audit function, because you can only audit things that are within the framework. It affects the scope. So if change management is not part of your governance model, God help you, then it's out of scope for an audit. Only things that are in your governance model are fair game to be audited. You can't just start making up stuff or looking for things. I do think this is a nice interview question. If you're keeping a running tally of things to ask in an interview, to ask what's your IT governance model. Are you centralized, decentralized, federated? You don't care about the answer. It just means you know how to ask a good question. They'll be happy to answer it. Now, why do different businesses choose different governance models and different organizational structures. Hopefully you're getting brainwashed at this point, so we can say it all together. What drives any decision in business? The business requirements. Thank you very much for playing along. Good, good. So here's where we are at this point. We've talked about the three possible organizational structures, centralized, decentralized, and federated. Now we need to get into how does an auditor have to change his or her audit technique when looking at these different organizations. So that's what's coming up next. For auditing a centralized IT function, reviewing all the documentation ahead of time, this is just part of audit planning, is reviewing all the policies and procedures ahead of time. Does that sound like a lot of work? Yes. It's a lot easier if they follow a framework with their documentation that you're already familiar with. That speeds up the process. Because as an auditor, you're hunting for these incompatible functions that we talked about before. And you want to make sure that not just the segregation policy, but all the centralized policies are being followed, of course. On the other hand, auditing a decentralized organization, you're going to review all the documentation which might be spread out throughout the organization instead of being in one location. And something you're going to have to wrestle with in this type of model is, are all the locations following the standards that are set forth in their own policies? Now, this could be a smorgasbord of standards. It could get a lot more complicated. Auditing, the book doesn't talk about the process of auditing a federated model, but obviously this would be a blend of the two. But all three start with reading the policies and procedures ahead of time when you're planning your audit. So in class, I would ask you this question: which one do you think is if you're an auditor, which one do you prefer? Which one would you rather audit? What's easiest on the auditor? I think it's clear that the easiest thing to audit is a centralized model, because everything is in one place. You can get to everything a lot more easily. So, and decentralized is very difficult. Federated the most common, but auditors tend to like a centralized process just because it's simpler to audit. Okay, so that wraps up the organizational structure part. Number two that COSO cares about for IT governance is the computer center. Nobody calls it that anymore. It's old-fashioned. We call it the data center. And we're going to get into some IT stuff, but also some non-IT stuff, and mercifully some non-financial stuff. But the physical location, even the geographic location of your data center. Where in the country is it? Is your data center in Tornado Alley? That dictates what some of your security policies and processes are going to be. Are you on the coast? Are you on a fault line? Are you in a blizzard-prone area? Are you in an area that's prone to flooding? Ding, ding, ding. These are things that need to be examined for your data center. So, for example, would you put a data center right beside the Mississippi River? Probably not, because the whole thing would flood and you'd have all your servers underwater, for example. If you've never been inside a data center, I've just got some pictures of some simple ones. Sometimes a data center can just be a special room, maybe smaller than this, maybe bigger than this. Maybe it's an entire facility that is your data center. And of course, for a data center this size, you have to get in all these white boxes up here are, I'm assuming, part of the air conditioning system. So you have to have fully redundant air conditioning, fully redundant power, fully redundant fire suppression, battery backups, generators, the works. Not the old-fashioned computer center that COSO is kind of referring to with the whirling tape drives that are spinning in the background in every good 50s science fiction movie. Some other pictures of data centers. They should be nice and clean and neat with servers that are rack mounted. So you'll notice we've got a rack in the cyber classroom now that I'll be populating with some servers and network gear for demonstration purposes. Some nice cable management here. This is what a bank of battery backups looks like in a data center. So you might have a single one, like a small home battery backup attached to your PC. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. For a data center, you walk into the battery backup room and it just looks like a room full of car batteries, basically, which is kind of what they are. so that in the event of power loss from the power company, the batteries kick in immediately. Now the batteries can only last for so long, but typically the point of having batteries is to provide constant power to the servers just long enough for the generators to kick in, and that's your long-term power. But of course it's more expensive, but it'll get you through a disaster, hopefully. Other pictures of data centers, what nice, neat cable management looks like. Here's an example of what bad cable management looks like. Okay, if you're an auditor, just with your auditor hat on, you walk into this room versus you walk into this room, does that affect how deeply you're going to look at the controls in that organization? Yes, even if it's subconscious. There's a big difference between walking into this room and walking into this room. And obviously you can find a lot more non-compliance problems in a room like this. So physical components that can be in scope for an audit include things like the air conditioning system, including its regular preventive maintenance and schedule, as well as humidity, because data centers like to be very cool, but they have to be about 50% humidity, not too wet, because wet is bad, not too dry. Dry is bad, of course, for static electricity. Fire suppression and redundancy in the fire suppression can get expensive, and this is something that does need to be audited on a regular basis. Fault tolerance within the servers themselves, so having RAID arrays for your hard drives provides redundancy of server storage space. UPS, or just the batteries that the servers are plugged into, are very auditable. So within the COSO framework, it does mention fault tolerance, but doesn't do a deep dive into what fault tolerance is in a way that makes sense for IT people. Fault tolerance includes a number of concepts like failover. If you have two routers in failover mode or two firewalls in failover mode, if this one goes away, this one immediately comes online and kicks in. Mirroring of two servers, they have two servers set up identically, or two hard drives set up identically that are just mirroring each other. You're literally duplicating everything. RAID is a more efficient way of doing this, but mirroring is probably the most fault-tolerant way. High availability is another term for, it's a specific type of fault tolerance. High availability can include things like clustering, clustering of servers together, clustering of network gear together, so that it's doing, in some cases, load balancing, which is a separate issue from fault tolerance. So this gets into a complicated area that I think IT auditors need to have some familiarity with, but ultimately, since you're just auditing the controls that are in that organization's security policy, that's the only thing that you have to audit. I would say typically an IT auditor is not going to come in and look at how a system administrator set up all the clustering of servers. That gets a little too out in the weeds. More typically, an auditor is going to come in and just make sure the AC, fire suppression, battery backups, generators are all functioning. Now remember, in the Hall's 3 steps of planning, simple testing, and substantive testing, a simple test of controls would just be making sure all the batteries are on, with a little green light, as opposed to a substantial, more substantive test would be going through each individual battery, looking at each label to see when the last time it was checked would be, and then going through log files to see when the last time they were activated was. So more time consuming. Just an example of the difference between two levels of testing. So a lot of the physical controls, I think this is the interesting part of auditing, because a lot of the physical controls get into areas that are outside of the normal kind of domain of IT, such as the physical construction of the building, fire suppression, AC, and such. But by far, probably the most difficult area to audit, and the one that nobody wants you to audit, but you really need to, is the disaster recovery plan. This is something that every organization sucks at, in my own opinion. Nobody does it enough because it's expensive to do it right, and everybody's disaster recovery plan a lot of times is just hoping for the best, and that's not a good plan. Things that everybody's DR plan is going to be different depending on the size, industry, complexity, organizational structure. It depends on a lot of things. But there are 4 common elements, and again, that are very auditable. The first is, has the company identified its critical applications? Where would these be documented? These would be documented in the disaster recovery plan that the security policy references, which means it's in scope for an audit. Because you can't identify every single software application as critical. You just can't. They're all, Sev 1. No. There have to be tiers. So which ones do we need to bring up first in the event of a disaster? The other 3 areas that are common to any DRP is having a specific disaster recovery team of people that are pre-designated, having some kind of backup facility, and there are different types of backup facilities. And number 4, offsite storage, and number 3 and number 4 are somewhat interrelated in terms of hot site, cold site. More on that in a second. But really, for governance, this is the hardest thing to govern when things get completely out of control. So certainly in our area, we're very familiar with the impact of flooding, and I certainly hope none of your families were caught up in all the flooding in Alton, Grafton, north of here over the summer, because it was pretty bad. Obviously, this is pretty bad for computer systems to get wet like this. But really, the problem in a disaster is not your technology. It's just not. It's not. Here it is. It's people showing up for work. That's your problem in a disaster. You might have a fantastic disaster recovery plan that is built on an assumption which is false. That assumption being that everybody's going to show up. Your networking guy, your systems guy, your mainframe guy, your cybersecurity person, your operations person, your management, your end user representatives, that everybody's going to show up to be on this conference call, and maybe they just can't because they're busy helping out their families in a disaster. And this is what takes a lot of difficult thinking about what a company is going to do to take care of its employees and take care of its employees' families in the event of an emergency, because typically 30% of your employees show up for work in a major disaster. That is very difficult to plan for. So just as an example, this could be a very simple checklist of things to look at as part of a disaster recovery plan audit. These are things that are common to every disaster recovery plan and things that you can look for to make sure that they're there, make sure that they're working. But what you really want to test is whether your backup site is going to come online in the event of a disaster. So having a redundant location is a good way to provide business continuity to the organization. And so there's a laundry list of things that can be checked, but it's expensive and intrusive to test, because you can't just flip the switch. Okay, let's cut over to our secondary site. Wham! In the middle of the day. It's disruptive. But there are a couple of types of sites that range from less expensive to more expensive. Now, obviously, here's a nice picture that shows you some of the differences. Most people want their backup site to come online within minutes, like immediately. They just want it to cut over and be back up and running. This is known as a hot site, so you've got a fully redundant data center in another part of the country, another geographic zone. Not in the same floodplain that you're in, or in a completely different part of the country or a different part of the world. It's the most expensive thing to do because all of you have redundant everything and it's all up and running constantly, just waiting, just in case. This can be prohibitively expensive. So what a lot of companies do is they go, okay, well, we can't afford that, but we'll do a warm site where we've got another location and maybe we don't have everything up and running all the time, but we can crank it up pretty quickly in a matter of hours or 24 hours. We can get everything up and running and then fail it over. The cheapest would be a cold site, which is where you're renting a room. It's a warehouse, it's a room somewhere, and it's your location where if you need to create an offsite data center, maybe it's just a bunch of empty racks and you can, haul a bunch of equipment there, get it all set up. It might take you a couple of weeks to get it back up and running. So cheap, more expensive, the most expensive. It's just a trade-off. These are not technology decisions. These are business decisions that business management has to make. And once they make those decisions, say, this is what we're going to go with, that is what you get to audit. Just FYI, there are a lot of companies that provide these services. SunGard used to be the number one, kind of the big name in this space, SunGard Availability Services. And then I learned 3-4 years ago now that they were bought out by a company called FIS. You can always look at a Gartner report to see who the top offsite failover services are, disaster recovery services are. The problem is in a disaster, the problem with SunGard was a lot of times they'd be oversubscribed. So if you can imagine every company in the Mississippi area when it floods, all wanting to use SunGard services all at the same time, maybe they have enough, capacity to handle all those companies at the same time. Maybe they don't. So just something to look at in your contract when you're negotiating these things. So what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned that hosting your own data center is hard. It's complicated. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of specialized activity. There are a lot of physical controls to manage. There's a lot of expense to it. Wouldn't it be great if we could just outsource this? Can't we just pay somebody else to mow our lawn instead of mowing our lawn ourselves? Can't we just, outsource this? Then we don't have to worry about it. Well, yes and no. Can we outsource things in the IT function? Absolutely. And we do this all the time. And there are a lot of benefits to doing this. Does it absolve us of our responsibility of auditing that IT function, no matter where it is? No, it does not. The organization is still responsible and accountable for auditing these systems, no matter where they are. So why do we outsource things? Well, maybe we don't have the in-house expertise to run our own data center. Maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's better, maybe it's faster, maybe it's all of these. Data centers in particular are good candidates to outsource, and this is where cloud computing comes into play. Cloud computing is not any kind of special technology. Cloud computing is simply the business decision to, I'm going to move me back up here because I want to. I don't know why I'm flashing. There we go. Cloud computing is just outsourcing. It's just outsourcing the IT function, or at least the data center function, to another organization that can do it better, faster, cheaper, more securely than we can. Does not absolve us of having to audit for security, for privacy, for making sure we're compliant with SOX, etc. Whether you use Amazon Web Services or Azure or Google as software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, look these terms up and make sure you're comfortable with the differences. And if you're not, let me know because I can give you some examples in class. But you want to be very comfortable between the differences between these forms of cloud computing. And trust me, it's getting even more complicated. There are a lot more acronyms we're starting to use in the cloud computing space. These terms have been around for at least 10 years. They're newer ones, but I don't want to needlessly complicate things. What drives the decision for cloud computing? Say it with me. Say it all together. The business requirements. Yes, drives every business decision and hence every technology decision. So a cloud provider is a third party. They're a great example of a third party. If a third party provides services to your organization, can you audit them? Should you audit them? Yes. Why is cloud computing getting super popular? Because it makes a compelling business case. For one thing, a cloud computing platform, a remotely hosted data center for your organization, can be spun up very quickly. For example, Amazon Web Services, I can configure a new server in under 5 minutes, whereas in a non-virtualized environment where I have to build the physical server, it's going to take a week for it to arrive. It's going to take another 3 days for me to configure and test it and get up and running. So 5 minutes versus a week. This is a compelling business case. And it's super cheap. Why is it super cheap? Well, there's some magic involved, and part of that magic is around virtualization. So network virtualization, server virtualization, storage virtualization. Really, virtualization at the end of the day allows you to do more with less. If you can have one physical box that's emulating 10 different servers or 20 different servers just as efficiently, well, you're saving a lot of money, and it's a lot easier to manage because it's all centralized. The downside to cloud computing is, of course, IT people are control freaks, and they don't like to give up control like that. Legacy systems like mainframes and such don't typically run very well in the cloud, so maybe you have to keep supporting that yourself. But by far, the trade-off is over ownership and privacy. So if all of your data is in the cloud, well, who owns it? This came up in the InfoSec class with the hacker that hacked Amazon Web Services and got into Capital One's accounts because they were using Amazon Web Services. So who owns the data at that point? Was it Amazon because they're hosting it? Was it Capital One because it's their data? Obviously, Amazon wants to say it was Capital One, and Capital One wanted to say, oh, it's Amazon's fault, which it wasn't. But this makes auditing a little more complicated. And when you're auditing third parties, you get into another series of documentation. Now, stay with me. So remember, just because you're outsourcing doesn't mean you're absolved of responsibility as a management team. So the organization still has to be SOX compliant. They still have to audit against COSO, even if you own the hardware and my organization doesn't. A callback to Chapter 1, where we said there's, just like GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, there's something called GAS, Generally Accepted Auditing Principles, and that there are 10 very general principles, and that there were these SAS documents that were the authoritative interpretations of what those principles meant. The new language is an SSA instead of a SAS, which, and I have to look it up over here, a Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements. You don't need to memorize that. But an SSE, just like a SAS, is an authoritative interpretation of an auditing principle. So SSAE 16 is was the new one that was replaced by SSAE 18 is the latest one. So this is the latest standard for auditing third parties. What's a third party? Well, like a cloud provider would be a third party. This is one of the more complicated areas, third-party auditing. When you're doing a third-party audit, you're going to look at something called a SOC report. A SOC report is basically a self-declaration from the third party of how they are in compliance with, for example, SOX and or COSO. So, and there are a number of different SOC reports. SOC is Service and Organization Control. Don't worry about that. Just a SOC report is something the auditor would need ahead of time when they're doing their audit planning. So, as part of your audit plan is to review all documentation. If you're auditing a third party, you have to review their SOC report to see if there's anything missing or if you smell something funny that you want to look at further. So a SOC 1 report is just financial information. A SOC 2 report is probably what we care about because that's going to include your IT security controls. And a SOC 3 is a more specialized report that's aimed for a non-technical audience. So I would say a SOC 2 report is the one that you would care about. Can you request a SOC 2 report from your third-party provider? Absolutely. Okay, so that's it. I've trash talked COSO a little bit. It's good for what it is. For SOX compliance, it's a great framework. Don't get me wrong. For IT governance, it's lacking in some areas. So what could we use instead of or in addition to COSO? Well, that's what we're going to get into next time, and it's not in your textbook, but I'm going to give you some stuff to read on the blackboard. See you later.